Now, that's how we start a record-breaking Congress. So I first want to introduce and thank Andrew Balio, who is the president and the founder of the Future Symphony Institute.
Thank you so much. I just want to tell you one little thing about the Future Symphony Institute.
No, we really, Andrew.
Oh, sorry.
Andrew. Yeah.
Anyhow,
sorry.
Okay,
Thank you. I also want to introduce and to thank Dan Cathy, my friend, who is the president and chairman of Chick-fil-A. But what you also need to know about Dan is he and I just spent, as well as 20 other people, the last 2 days together bicycling Charleston to Savannah. And yeah, that was about 140 miles. Dan was a whiz on a bike. Victor Dover led our fearless team through urban design. Chick-fil-A is a major underwriter of the Congress and of the CNU, and it underscores the commitment that Dan Cathy has and Chick-fil-A has about creating great places. Dan did nothing but ask amazing questions and learn through our urban design tour. So with that, I would like to thank and introduce Dan Cathy.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn, and I got a very contagious dose of CNU via some of your common carriers like Lou Oliver and Drew Theodani that's here, and so I got infected. This is my third CNU conference, and so I'm a fast learner. I've seen 4 major transitions in our little family business that's gone on for 72 years. My dad opened a tiny little diner, which was the typical roadside diner back in 1946. Then we migrated to shopping malls, and we were in some 600 shopping malls in their heyday back in the 80s and 90s and 2000. And then we migrated to the big box retailers. And you know all the story about that development with the Walmarts and Home Depots and the Lowe's that are out there. And now we see the next great migration, and that is what you are here to help us figure out. That's into the downtown areas. So we don't have chalkboard menus, but if you'll be patient with us, we'll be able to come to your aid with food safety and a lot of other good things that you might not get from some of the local entrepreneurs, but we'll fit into your development. Thank you so much. You're doing so many significant things for our society, and it so matches our corporate purpose to glorify God by being a faithful steward of all that's entrusted to us and to have a positive influence on all who come in contact with Chick-fil-A. Enjoy Savannah, enjoy the great state of Georgia, and for heaven's sakes, please eat more chicken. Thank you.
I really did have a blast biking with Dan, Victor, and all the other new urbanists, Fred Roddy. We had a blast. I encourage you all to do the biking tour in Louisville next year. It'll only be 100 miles. I want to invite Kevin Klinkenberg and Eric Brown now. Most of you know how Congresses get organized. They get organized through a partnership with the local host committee. And Eric and Kevin just represent the co-chairs, but know that this Congress was organized by an incredible team of the local host committee and their sponsors. In particular, we could not have put on this Congress the way that we did without their help. We and all of you owe Kevin and Eric, the entire local host committee, and their sponsors a debt of gratitude. So I want to thank them each. Thank you so much.
Good job.
And there is a lot that is going on this week. Tomorrow we're going to have an all-day discussion on the nexus of affordability. How do we invest in areas that have seen decades of disinvestment in a way that increases access to opportunities? On Friday, Peter Calthorpe and the Urban Footprint will be demoing their brand new modeling Friday afternoon. Also on Friday, we're going to have coders questioning how do form-based codes work, what works, what doesn't. And then finally, new this year, and there's a ton in the program. There's tours, there's art room, just really dive into it. But new this year, we'll be live streaming all of the plenaries. So this can be a global conversation. And to help facilitate that, Q&A will only be accepted via Twitter with the hashtag CNU26 plenary. So the moderators of each plenary will be able to take questions from all over the country and all over the world. We're going global, folks. So right now, standing together with these incredible co-chairs, I hereby open the 26th Annual Congress for the New Urbanism. All right, thank you. You guys are good. As many of you know, as part of the Congress effort, we feel it's so important to give back to the community. We come to Savannah during these 4 and 5 days and we learn from it. We study the squares, the street grid, the architecture, but we do more than that. The team actually arrived on site about 3 months ago to do our legacy charrettes, and this year we did 3. We did 2 in Savannah, in Southside and Eastside, and 1 in Brunswick. And so right now, please join me on the stage, the Mayor Pro Tem, Carolyn Bell, and the Director of Planning in Brunswick, Bren White-Dice. Bren's first. So Bren, on behalf of CNU, here's the report of the work that our awesome architects, David Schwartz, and architects, the lanyard that you're working, and his team. It was an incredible team. Thank you so much. And Mayor Pro Tem, please accept the 2 reports that the teams did, that Diru Tadani and Associates, and oh my gosh. David Schwartz, I'm so sorry. David Schwartz did the other one, and Eric Kronberg and Associates did Brunswick. I'm sorry, team. I didn't have my notes with me. Oh. And Carolyn, would you like to say a few words and welcome us?
Yes. Good evening. First, thank you for these 2 reports, and I'm sure the City Council, the Mayor, the City Council, and the staff will be pleased to explore the work that you've done, and we accept these reports and certainly will turn them over to staff. Now, in my official capacity, I do have one of my colleagues at least one here, so I would like for him to at least stand, wave your hand, Bill Dorrance. He is the alderman for the 2nd District. Which is the district that you're located in downtown. So on behalf of Mayor Eddie DeLoach, who is in Washington, he's out of town, and the 146,000 plus citizens here in Savannah, Georgia, first let me say welcome and thank you for selecting Savannah, Georgia as the site for your conference this year. We are so pleased to have the Congress for New Urbanism, your 26th session, is that right?
Our 26th session, and don't forget to say that it's record-breaking. It's the most attendees ever because you have such an awesome city and region.
Gee, I don't even have to say it, yes. We are so very appreciative of you selecting Savannah as the site. We really do hope that you'll get an opportunity to enjoy some of the sights and sounds of Savannah while you're here. I was talking to Kevin before coming on stage. I'm sorry we did not order perfect weather for the entire duration of your stay, but it's not too bad. I don't think it's too bad. So please enjoy your stay here. Thank you for all the work, the fine work that you do, and all the work that will come out of this conference. We look forward to reading the reports, and we look forward to hearing of the great things that you're doing. Thank you, and stay as long as you want, spend as much money as you can, help to boost the economy. We love all of that. Thank you.
So for those of you who have attended previous Congresses, we generally have had a larger to-do when we've handed over the reports. But again, Kevin and Eric wanted to do things a little bit differently this year, and I think they've improved upon it. So instead of having a little to-do up here as we hand out the reports, we'll be discussing these reports in detail with the teams, Eric Kromberg, David Schwartz, Diru Tadani, see, I got it right, on Saturday. And the public is welcome. And the idea here is to critique the reports, what works, what doesn't, and then more importantly, to move to implementation. What are the steps that need to be taken next? And so I think in that way, these become action items for the community to consider on how to move forward. And particularly with Kevin and Eric living here, being able to carry that on. So please join us on Saturday to learn and hear more about the 3 legacy projects. I'm sorry now to turn to a little bit of a bummer. As many of you know, and with an organization as old as CNU's, we begin to lose some of our members. And what is particularly powerful for CNU is that we are not an organization that drives. Our membership is not like AAA where you get a member card. Our strength is in our members. We are able to do what we do because we support the vision and the leadership of our members. So when we lose members through death, it's particularly devastating. Here tonight, we'll hear 3 tributes. Liz Plater-Zyberg, the founder and principal of DPZ Co-Design, will talk about Vincent Scully. Steve Mon, the founder of Leland Development, will talk about Jackie Benson. And Scott Bernstein, founder, all of these founders of the Center for Neighborhood Technology, will talk about and pay tribute to Hank Dittmar. So please join me in welcoming our 3 guests to the stage to talk about our treasured losses.
Good evening. These remembrances are a sad and glorious part of CNU's annual gatherings. They are educational too, as we learn of our sometimes not evident provenance. So let us focus on the glory this evening, the individuals who contributed to the birth, growth, and success of this organization and the work of its members. Architectural historian Vincent Scully is surely one of the new urbanism's spiritual fathers. Many of us would not be doing what we do if not for him. Sharing this great debt to Scully are generations of students and the readers of his 24 or so books that continue to vividly engage. 35 years ago, American architects were in the thrall of the New York Five, those designers of white boxes that emulated early modernism, never minding that this approach resonated little with the American public. Scully provided the counterpoint to this academic mandate. For Scully, American architecture was a worthy and rich foundation for contemporary invention. He inspired our interest in the culture of American building, not just public buildings and monuments, but also the house and the community, the American vernacular. With poignant sensitivity to the everyday experience of people in the built environment, he championed the power of architecture to elevate our spirits and change our lives. Scully also brought to our attention the value of the public realm. As early as 1963, in the essay, The Death of the Street, he called attention to modern architecture's neglect and indeed assault on the public realm. This combined respect for building history and public space empowered his students to address the everyday buildings of cities. Scully's teaching made history contemporary. The past and present are one, a bridge to the future that can support continuity. His students became designers, lawyers, developers, college presidents, and elected leaders. The first new urbanist community in Turkey was developed by Scully alumnus Esat Eddin. He often used the public pulpit to extol the virtues of the new urbanism, usually at yet another award ceremony. He received many, even memorably one event at the White House, an event which could not be ignored by the media. His principled sense of civic responsibility still ricochets today in the renewed impetus to rebuild McKim Mead & White's Pennsylvania Station in Manhattan, its loss so memorably described in his lectures and writings. Looking at him here, one of new urbanism's staunchest promoters, we can imagine Scully reminding us of our role as stewards, of cities and of knowledge. We might imagine also his exhorting us to record what the new urbanism has achieved, to keep the record straight, that others might not skew the perspective. Scully's time among us represents an era, a time of recovering the civilization of building community, indeed, a special time in history, and for this we are grateful.
Jackie Benson was my personal rock star. Jackie was a marketing and sales guru who was associated with the new urbanism from its earliest days. Her tireless effort to shape and communicate the many benefits of new urbanist projects led directly to the success of some of the finest examples. Her seminal work at Seaside and then Rosemary Beach could be said to have launched 1,000 ships. Jackie's many projects also included Vickery, Clark's Grove, Tributary, Glenwood Park, Hammond's Ferry, Storrs Center, Warwick Grove, and Eastmore. Jackie was smart, funny, and a very straight shooter. She was also known upon occasion to have one of the sharpest of tongues, when a quick dose of, "Are you kidding me?" was just what was called for. She had just the right mix of charm, humor, and steely determination to get recalcitrant client developers moving in the right direction. Jackie had a special gift for herding cats. I first met Jackie on a bus ride at CNU Denver many years ago. Her vivacious spirit had me captivated from the start. Seated next to one another and making small talk led Jackie to ask me, what was it I did? Well, I answered, I am a real estate developer. After a stage pause, 1, 2, 3. Oh, well, then I offer my condolences. I knew then that we would become the very best of friends. Jackie served on the Board of Governors for the Seaside Institute. She was a founding board member of the National Town Builders Association. She served as president of the CNU Atlanta chapter. And she also served on the Earthcraft House Community Task Force. Jackie was green before green became a movement. Jackie was a visionary in that she understood that new urbanism's infrastructure is uniquely suited to create the social structures that help foster civility and community. She always had the end result in mind. She knew that people could be more caring for one another if they lived in a place that is designed to foster the warm embrace of family and friends. Enhancing human interaction was always at the heart of her message. Jackie was a great teacher and a matchmaker of people. She loved new urbanism because it allowed her to bring talented people together to help create enduring places that people love. Her children and grandchildren will miss her, and we will miss her too.
Hello. Last year, I noticed a print shop double window while on a charrette with several of you. One side of the window said, "Listen first." The other said, "Then design." Hank Dittmar lived by that principle. It didn't mean he didn't know when to be tough. Our friend John Anderson reminds us, never bring a PowerPoint to a knife fight. But he had that sense for using a light hand and an agile touch, not features of the big systems he spent a life either leading or working around. He had what we jokingly called the collaboration gene and no respect for those who did not. Here's how we met. It was a privilege to help lead a movement to change the rules that shape transportation, too often used to bypass or pave over the places we live in and love. Started by 6 of us in 1990, it quickly gained the support of the whole nation, and we needed a new leader. Such a bench to draw from. We heard about this guy in charge of a large metro area capital budget, Hank Dittmar, and we interviewed him by telephone only. He had the voice announcers dream of and the clarity that politicians never achieve. I sensed a tall, preppy guy, but he knew his stuff, so we hired him. And walking into a meeting a few weeks later, somebody waved at me sort of weakly. Guy looked like he could use a good meal. It was Hank when he spoke. He was really good. We lived in different places, but for the next decade, not a day passed without our scheming successfully or trying it again better. What a privilege to know that your business partner could deliver. Quick anecdote, we secured a multi-issue congressional hearing, something that usually takes divine intervention. A skeptical chair thought resilient transport after 9/11 was worth less than military action, and upset that we'd landed the head of the French high-speed rail to testify during a time when anything foreign, even French fried potatoes, was treated with suspicion. Congressman Oberstar started joking on live TV in French with the CEO for high-speed rail for 5 minutes, and then Jim said, "Don't worry, Mr. Chairman, it was nothing subversive," which broke the ice. I'd say nice setup, Hank. He did that every day. Listen first served him well when his dream came knocking. His Royal Highness's outfit, the Prince's Foundation, sought a new director, and they recruited Hank, who by this time had all spent years in the U.S., chairing or co-chairing boards such as the Congress for New Urbanism. His leadership and support of the Prince deeply influenced U.S. practice and helped many of us relight our candles at a time when that was desperately needed. We had convinced Senator Moynihan some years ago that not only to replace the highway bill with a transportation bill, but with something that respected the rights of people in existing places over the rights of places that didn't yet exist. And when we proposed this, an adversary stated, "You know, guys, this is Washington. If you want Washington, if you want vision," he said, "get an optometrist." But we persevered, and those leaders needed an outside game, and they needed insider speak translation too. Hank was that inside-outside ambassador. Wow. Hank's action during his all-too-short life took courage. His product was change. He could be disruptive without being destructive. His style was orchestra leader. He could make a living doing this work, but it comes at a real cost. As they say, it ain't easy being green. So when he told us casually a couple of years ago he started chemotherapy, he set out to scribe a legacy. He's self-published essays, poetry, and art. He stated there's no smart way to build stupidly. He convened a bunch of us with Andres and others, and ever since then, the Lean Urbanism Council members exchange a riot of emails and designs to get good things done quickly. His upcoming book, by the way, is Do-It-Yourself Cities, and I hope you can all buy one soon. He channeled St. David, Welsh patron, who said, "Be steadfast like me and do the little things." So since our collective starts in this room with Hank, I can say we inhaled him, and in turn, he inhaled us too. Whoever said we shouldn't inhale what's good? In the Jewish tradition, we say there's 3 crowns: the crown of royalty, of wealth, and of religion, but the crown of a good name outshines them all. Well, God bless you, Hank, and all who inhale you, and I want to add a thanks to his family for the courage to support his work and his dreams, to our UK friends who wanted to inhale a little bit of him too, and for the Congress for New Urbanism for the privilege of working together with people like Hank on such important work. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Liz, Steve, and Scott for those heartfelt tributes. And people who know me know that I'm corny, and I'd like for us all to take a moment of silence right now, because there's no one of those three that didn't impact just about everybody in this room. I know I cried when I heard about Jackie and about Hank. So a moment of silence, please. I think the best way we can remember those who make an impact on our lives is to continue to live and work in their honor. And so I hope that by the work that CNU does, as members, as the organization, as the board, we can continue to honor the contributions of Vincent Scully, Jackie Benson, and Hank Dittmar. Changing gears a little bit back to the Congress, I want to make sure that we invite everyone to the opening reception at Johnson Square immediately following tonight's plenary. So, small joke, we have had very little rain on any of the Congresses in recent memory, like the last 10, 15 years. It rained Dallas, for example, CNU 23, torrential rainstorms several weeks before, no rain during the Congress, torrential rainstorms 3 weeks after. So we come here for Savannah planning in the fall, and Kevin and Eric say, May, Savannah, never rains. We're having all of our receptions outside. We made no accommodations whatsoever with tents or anything because we were short. It never rains in Savannah in May. Well, there's a tropical depression coming through. CVS, others have umbrellas. There will be no tents, but we're awesome, folks. We do have a tent? Oh, they got a tent. Again, did I mention the awesomeness of the local host committee? Now I would like to invite Emily Talon, professor at the University of Chicago, CNU fellow, CNU National Board member, and my good friend to the stage to introduce Julian Agyeman, tonight's keynote speaker.
Thank you, everybody. It's my great privilege to introduce Julian Agyeman, who is a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. He is the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainabilities. Pretty much sounds like what we try to do here in New Urbanism. It's the intentional integration of social justice and sustainability. He was trained in the UK. He was initially a geographer. He still is a geographer. Also has training in botany and conservation policy and also urban studies. He centers his research on critical explorations of the relationship between human nature and the urban environment, and especially how those relations interact with notions of justice and equity. Worldwide, he's recognized as an expert, an innovator, and thought leader. He has the most amazing CV I have ever seen. He's one of the 15 most highly cited urban planning academics in North America. His wide-ranging and influential publications include Mind the Gap, Why Do People Act Environmentally, and What Are the Barriers to Pro-Environmental Behavior? And that book, by the way, is the most highly cited journal article by an urban planning academic in all of North America. Oh my God, okay, I can only be so lucky that 5 people read my articles. He's the author or editor of 11 books, including Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World. And in addition, some other book titles are Sustainable Communities and the Challenge of Environmental Justice, The New Countryside, Ethnicity, Nation, and Exclusion in Contemporary Rural Britain. A final publication title is Environmental Justice and Sustainability in the Former Soviet Union. Awesome. He was co-founder in 1988 and chair until 1994 of the Black Environment Network. the first environmental justice-based organization of its kind in Britain. Julian is a highly sought-after speaker, and we're very lucky to have him here at CNU, so please help me in welcoming Julian to the stage.
This is what happens when you allow people to put their papers on your presentation. So let's see if we can do something with this. Here we go. Okay, should work. Thank you. Well, thanks for making this happen. It's been several years that we've been talking about me coming and speaking to CNU, and I'm really glad to be here on a rainy May day. From this, it looks like I'm here to sell you books and to get you to tweet and increase my Twitter readership, but I'm not here to do anything like that. I'm really here to give you this idea about just sustainabilities, because I think, as Emily mentioned, just sustainabilities will provide you with a framework to integrate some of the ideas that you have and that you're working on, and that I've seen over CNU's work over the last 10, 15, 20 years that I've been following it. First, though, as part of a new pledge I made when I gave a talk in Augsburg University in Minneapolis, I've become more and more increasingly aware that what we talk about as difference and diversity in the United States, we usually think about difference and diversity in terms of newer populations. We don't talk about First Nations people like they do. I'm based at the moment in Montreal, Canada. Every conference you go to, there is a welcome by the local First Nations people, a leader, an elder, etc. Similarly, in November, I was in Australia, and the same thing happens. And I think here in the US, we need to recognize that we are sitting now on land that was colonized from other people. And as far as I could find in my research, it was the Muskogee or the Creek and others. And I think we need to pay our respects to the elders, to the past, the present, and future, and commit to a principle of respect and care for the country as part of this meeting. And what I want to do is play you a short 3-minute video made by the First Nations Placemaking Council of Canada. But I think it gives you some idea of some of the forgotten voices when we talk about difference and diversity and belonging. So if we can...
What does belonging look like if nothing of your culture, history, language, or art is visible in the streets, parks, buildings where you live? How can you ever feel welcome there? The Indigenous Placemaking Council seeks to restore Indigenous presence to Canadian cities, towns, and communities.
Key point there was this word belonging. I've been thinking more and more and more about this word belonging. And the young man is saying, how can we, feel that we belong? and this is going to be a theme of what I'm going to be saying in my remarks. But let me just take you back a little 15 years to the beginnings of thinking about just sustainabilities. And this was around 2000 when myself and somebody I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, Professor Bob Bullard, the father of environmental justice, and a colleague of mine from the UK, Bob Evans, started to think about how do we move the sustainability conversation on in terms of justice, because environmental justice was doing pretty well, but this new conversation was starting called sustainability, and it was almost always mentioned in terms of environmental sustainability. I called this the equity deficit in sustainability. There was an equity deficit in how people were thinking about sustainability, how they were talking about it, and how they were practicing it. You look at all the best practice databases at that time. It was all about recycling and greenhouse gases. It was all about environmental aspects, very important, but they're not the whole picture. I could see a green world as being a very socially unjust world. How do we marry justice and sustainability? And the quote really that I think encapsulates everything we were thinking was, sustainability cannot simply be a green or environmental concern, important though environmental aspects of sustainability are. A truly sustainable society is one where wider questions of social needs and welfare and economic opportunity are integrally related to environmental limits imposed by supporting ecosystems. So really what we were looking at there is a balance of 4 conditions: improving our quality of life and well-being, meeting the needs of both present and future generations, justice and equity in terms of recognition, process, procedure, and outcome. And let me just pause there. Recognition, very important aspect of justice. Recognition, Me Too, Black Lives Matter, reconciliation, ideas of reconciliation. These are fundamental forms of justice. Justice isn't only about procedural or process-based justice. It's about the recognition that you belong. And we will talk more about that as I go through. And then finally, the final aspect of this 4-pillar or 4-condition notion of just sustainabilities is the idea of living within limits. I have a science and social science background. My formulation of just sustainabilities is with the rigors of the notion of limits to ecosystem services and the limits to ecosystems. We live in a world of limits. Those of us who are old enough to remember some of the first pictures of the planet from outer space, the big blue marble, there is no planet B, there was no pipeline elsewhere. We have one Earth, and so I'm very well aware that the formulation of just sustainabilities is living within ecosystem limits, or so-called one planet living. Now, as I move towards giving you some examples of what I think of as just sustainabilities, 2 overarching thoughts are occurring to me. And again, these are things that I want you to think about as I go through my comments. The best definition of urban planning, bar none, is Emeritus Professor Patsy Healy from Newcastle in England. Urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. Simple. Coexistence and shared space. Remember those words. Coexistence and shared space. But then Leonie Sandercock from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, she takes it a step further. She said, this speaks with equal clarity about environmental, transport, housing, and other conflicts, reminding us that whether we like it or not, we share space on the planet with others who in many ways are not like us. And we need to find ways of coexisting in these spaces, from the next door neighbor to the street, the neighborhood, the city, and the region. It would be easy to manage coexistence in shared space if we all ate alike, dreamt alike, thought alike, looked alike, prayed alike. That's not the case. That is not the case. We are living in increasingly cities of difference. where we're in the presence of otherness, how do we manage our coexistence in shared space? It's a challenge. And again, I'm not coming here as an expert to say, this is how we do it. I'm asking the same questions as you are. But we surely have to ask these questions. We can't not ask these questions. Second overarching point is, what is the relationship between belonging and becoming? We are very good, I am very good at thinking about what our cities can become. I can give you all kinds of prescriptions. One of my books is called Sharing Cities. So we've had, becoming ideas like smart cities, sharing cities, resilient cities, sustainable cities. But what we're not as good at is belonging. Thinking about belonging, recognition, reconciliation, difference, diversity, and inclusion. What we as urban planners and designers have got to do is bring these two together, belonging and becoming. Our cities will never become what they truly can become unless we broaden the concept of belonging and we get better as city builders, as we get better at thinking about belonging. And I want to put it to you that just sustainabilities or humane scaled, as opposed to human scaled planning, helps us think through both together. Just sustainabilities, humane scale planning helps us think about belonging and becoming. And I think as a result, the end result will be much better than if elites plan the future of our cities. So what I'm going to do is give you 3 examples. Now, I've got 50 minutes. I have to be brief here. Several of my books cover much more detail than I'm going to be able to give you. But I'm going to give you 3 critical concepts around this idea of just sustainabilities. One is the idea of spatial justice. How do we allocate rights in urban spaces and places? How do we do that? I'm going to talk about culture, difference, and diversity. How do we recognize, understand, and engage difference, diversity, and cultural heterogeneity in inclusive, creative, and productive ways? How do we do that? And then I'm going to talk finally about sharing cities. How do we see the whole city as a shared space? How do we reinvent the urban commons? I'm convinced that progressive urbanists should focus on the notion of the urban commons, an equitable space, a just space. My phone's going crazy in my pocket here. Are you tweeting me? Please, if you are, keep doing it, because this feels good. So, first, I don't know how I can carry on now. First, spatial justice. So, this idea of spatial justice has been really making me think for a long time. And the best kind of thought I can come up with is from a British MP called David Lammy, and he says, just as social justice requires that life chances are not distributed along class lines, spatial justice requires that they are not distributed geographically. We have divided cities. Jerusalem, Nicosia, formerly Belfast in Northern Ireland. So we have walls across cities, but in the United States, we don't need walls. Hands up, who grew up in a town or city where there was a creek, a railway line, a freeway, or some other landscape feature, and on one side of it they lived and the other side you lived? Hands up. That's at least 1/3 to 1/2 of people. We have spatially unjust cities. And I want to offer this concept of spatial justice as a way for you, a lens for you to look at things that I'm now going to go on to describe that will be very familiar with you. So firstly, let's rethink urban streets through the lens of spatial justice. And we have 2 streets here. Massachusetts Avenue, near where I live in Cambridge, Mass, and Södervägen in Gothenburg. 2 streets, identical width. They couldn't look more different. The principle of allocation of rights to space on the US street is the size of your vehicle. The bigger your vehicle, the more rights you have to public space. Not so much in Sweden, where they have democratized the street. Politicians, planners have democratized the street. To the left of the streetcar, you have a slice of about 10% of the streetscape that is available to private vehicles. That's all. And there's nobody using that. The streetcars are frequent, cyclists, walkers. It's a very different street. Spatial justice has been imposed on that street. Not so much on Massachusetts Avenue, but a question that I want to ask that, you know, nobody, to my knowledge, is doing any research on. We know about the toxicological effects of and the effects of lead, and we took lead out of gas, and we've done a lot of things. But what about the kid growing up on these streets? The Swedish kid and the kid in Cambridge, Mass. How do those kids grow up differently wired as a result of seeing democracy and a democratized streetscape on the one hand in Sweden and organized chaos in Cambridge, Massachusetts? And this is Cambridge, Mass. This is about as good as it gets in many ways. Cambridge, Berkeley, Davis, Portland, you know, these are some of the best places. And this is what it looks like. How are the kids wired? Now, we've got the data. I mean, a lot of you will know of Don Appleyard's work, heavy traffic, moderate traffic, light traffic, go figure. There's more social interactions, more friendships on streets with light traffic. This is why we do traffic calming. There will be more interaction. I just wish that street in Sweden had a lot of people on it, because at the moment it looks pretty boring. But the point is that we calm down traffic, we increase interaction on streets. Now, we are doing this, we are beginning to do this, and you know, Mayor Bloomberg hired Janet Siddique Khan, who brought in Jan Gale, who I understand is going to be coming in tonight. Shame you're going to miss my talk, Jan, but maybe you're live streaming it right now. Who knows? But we are doing this in the United States, and we can do this. I mean, how many of us would have believed we would see scenes like these in New York? I never believed that. I never believed we'd get congestion charging in London and that it would end up being really popular and effective, and that every penny of the money would be put back into sustainable transportation. We can do this. And I think this is another point I want to make. Urban planning, sustainability must be about what is possible, not about what is probably going to happen. If we keep doing what we probably have always done, the same crap will happen. We need to break out of that and think about what is possible. But you know, too often we prove as humans that we're actually very good at showing who doesn't belong. We're really good at that with hostile and defensive architecture. This is spatial injustice at its meanest and most inhumane. Great tweet there. Spatial injustice at its meanest and most inhumane through hostile and defensive architecture. I'm going to check for that one. Somebody who tweets that gets a copy of one of my books, okay? Joking. But this, no, look at this. I mean, rich doors and poor doors, aren't we past that? You know, brutish defensive architecture trying to stop kids skateboarding, the armrests on seats to stop homeless people sleeping, the studs to stop homeless people sleeping. But actually the most cynical one for me is on the bottom left. Does anybody know which city that happened in and what that was? And I apologize to people down. Anybody? It was Seattle, actually. So that's in Seattle. The city of Seattle cynically used bike infrastructure, bike racks, sustainability infrastructure to stop homeless people sleeping under bridges. It doesn't get much more cynical when our sustainability and bike infrastructure is used to stop homeless people. I am in admiration of the cycle community in Seattle who said, no, don't you use our infrastructure, which we want you to use in good ways. Don't use it to stop a problem that we all know we have and you need to deal with in better ways. It's called the Amazon tax. But you've heard about the Amazon tax. Come, please, you must read up on that. I think this is a great idea, frankly. But that is a cynical use of sustainability infrastructure to create a hostile and defensive environment for people who are unfortunately homeless. But then, you know, when I think about it, walkability, which is one of the words that crops up most in all of our tweets and in all of our talk in New Urbanism, walkability can now be measured by WalkScore. Who owns the app for WalkScore? Redfin. Are we troubled by that a realtor owns the app for walkability? Think about the implications of that. We have commoditized sustainability to such an extent that it now sells, and it sells homes. The more walkable your neighborhood, the higher the rents, the higher the house prices. And I'll come back to that because that's one of the problems that we have in doing the good work we do. We have knock-on effects. And I saw a tweet that said, the science is in, walkable neighborhoods are good. And I thought of retweeting it, but saying, and the social science is in, walkable neighborhoods are gentrifying neighborhoods. So let's be aware of that. Now, one other idea that has come to my mind recently, my friend Elijah Anderson is a professor of sociology at Yale, and he has this idea, great idea, called the cosmopolitan canopy. And what the cosmopolitan canopy is, the idea is that for the most part, we as humans walk around the streets studiously avoiding eye contact with others. Which is fair enough, I do it, you all do, we all do it. But he says there are places in cities called cosmopolitan canopies where, quote, people are encouraged to treat others with a certain level of civility, or at least simply to behave themselves. And the picture on the cover of his book, which I urge any of you to read, is the Reading Terminal Market in Philadelphia. And he is a folk ethnographer. He watches, he listens, he observes how people interact. And I challenge you, think about places in your own cities that you could call cosmopolitan canopies, where we let go of all of those biases and other kind of things, and we accept difference, and we can sit and talk to somebody over a beer, usually over food. A lot of cosmopolitan canopies are food-based, and if I'd had longer to talk to you, I would talk a long time about the role of food in creating place and space, and we know about this. So I just put out there this idea of the cosmopolitan canopy as a space of respect, a space of engagement, a space of encounter. And I'll leave it with this question. Is there a role for planners and planning and urban designers in creating cosmopolitan canopies? Are they simply organic? Do they just happen because of something? Or can we design or create them? Or can we create the conditions through which cosmopolitan canopies occur? Often, children are involved as well. Children and food are good sticking places for cosmopolitan canopies. People can hang around and chat through issues when there are kids and food involved. Another solution that we often use to spatial injustices is the idea of sort of complete streets. When you think about the streets that I was describing as being spatially unjust, what's not to like about the idea of a complete street? A street that is designed around not just the automobile, but public transit, around people's needs of place, around the cyclist, around the walker, etc. We have masses of manuals, policies, regulatory structures. In Massachusetts, we have sort of competitions, and we do very well. We win a lot of competitions for our complete streets policies. And we've got some examples here. Swampscott, we've got Massachusetts Department of Transportation, City of Somerville, where Tufts University is, City of Toronto. Everybody has got these complete streets guides. So can we use the idea of complete streets to make our communities more equitable? Can we decrease spatial injustice on the streets? Or will complete streets result in enhanced livability only for the most privileged residents of cities? Now, one thing that really has struck me as a geographer is a statement made by a geographer, Doreen Massey, who sees places as having no fixed meaning. She says they are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. Places are social entities as much as they are physical entities. Yet our complete streets design guidance is very physically oriented. On the right, we have, guidance about a street that is being made more complete. And yet, in one of my books, I argue that the physically focused complete streets rhetoric disconnects streets from their significant social, structural, symbolic, discursive, and historical realities. Now, it's a challenge for designers. Designers are trained to design. How do we encapsulate the social, structural, symbolic, discursive, and historic realities? Again, it is a question. But there's two streets there. You don't design that street in Athens to be like what it is right now. And funnily enough, I gave this talk in Sheffield in the UK, and one young woman put a hand up and said, I used to live in an apartment just above that. She said, it's a wonderful place, and that's actually a market in there. Again, food as creating a livable environment. So one of my questions then is, social construct of the street, physical space of the street. How do we make complete streets? Who gets to say what a complete street is? And we have the strange case of Los Angeles. Very interesting, and this again was in one of my books that I'll tell you about. Can streets in a heavily immigrant metropolis, however multimodal the distribution of lane space, be said to be complete if they fail to include the livelihoods and economic survival of the vendors, the smells, the sights, the tastes of homelands, and the places for people to pause and shop? Until very recently, LA had made street vending illegal. Street vending is part of the DNA of Latino culture and Korean culture as well. How can you have complete streets if you're banning one of the key factors? So again, we need to think about the social and the physical aspects when we are talking about this idea of complete streets. A little bit of a book opportunity here. My book is called Incomplete Streets. This is what I do. I don't disagree at all with the concept of complete streets. I disagree with the way it's implemented. Incomplete streets. Now, the book series that I'm editor of is by Routledge. It's called The Equity, Justice, and the Sustainable City series. And here are 3 books: Incomplete Streets, Just Green Enough, and Green Gentrification. Some people are saying, hey, here's a way that we can get around the sort of the gentrification of some neighborhoods. Let's not do the super green schmear. Let's do just green enough. Let's clean up the neighborhood enough that it's clean and healthful, but not then so that it's susceptible to all the, the cafes with baristas with ponytails, with fake French accents, and that kind of thing that's going on. White boys with dreadlocks, that kind of stuff. Oh, that's called Portland, isn't it? Yeah, I forgot. But you get my point here. Look, we need to do this. We need complete streets. And we need walkability. but we need it for everyone. How do we disconnect sustainability improvements to neighborhoods from rental and house price increases? That's our essential challenge. Some would argue, and I have every, I can understand this, that the old redlining is being replaced by greenlining, that these neighborhoods, these green-lined neighborhoods, are increasingly exclusive neighborhoods. Racism isn't the direct cause, as it was with redlining, but socioeconomic segregation is the result of greenlining. And so, again, in the book, Incomplete Streets, we argue that many Complete Streets policies, plans, and efforts are systematically reproducing many of the urban, spatial, and social inequalities and injustices that have characterized US cities for the last century or more. So, Complete Streets isn't wrong, but how do we get it right? Finally, on the spatial justice front, I want to just briefly touch on some great work on urban parks by my friend Seth Lowe at City University of New York. Rethinking Urban Parks. I don't advertise other people's books too often, but some people's books I think it's worth advertising. Seth's book is called Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity. Not biodiversity, cultural diversity. And the headline is, in this new century, we're facing a different kind of threat to public space. Not one of disuse, but of different kinds of design and management that exclude some people and reduce social and cultural diversity. What she's saying is it's not disuse, the druggies, or antisocial use in parks, it's the design and the management of public spaces that is becoming a problem. And the reason why she mentions this is, and in fact, I'm going to give you one example. So design issues, I won't touch on that, but let me give you a management issue that occurred in a park in the UK that had a very, very deleterious effect on cultural and social diversity. So it was a park like that in the city of Bristol in southwest England. And in the early 1980s, the local wildlife trust said, you know what, this ryegrass just isn't doing it for us. We need to increase biodiversity. Let's create a wildflower meadow in this park. And the park department agreed, yeah, great idea, let's do it. So they changed the management regimen of the park, and over 2 or 3 years, they had a beautiful dense sward, they had much more biodiversity. The local media were invited into the park and said, hey, this looks great. And then somebody said, you know what? There were a lot more African, Caribbean, and Asian people in this park before we did this ecological garden, this wildflower meadow. And then questions were asked, why are they not using this space? What is it? And there's a residual fear of snakes, apparently. A residual fear of snakes. The fact that there are no poisonous snakes in Britain is irrelevant. Snakes are, in some cultures, just not nice things to be around. Here's the question. An ecological management regimen, a good thing, results in a bad thing, a drop in cultural and social diversity, a very bad thing. Who's right? Do we do the ecological, or do we respect the cultural? Well, of course, I don't know, but we need to ask these questions. And let me ask you also, if somebody from the Wildlife Trust had been African, Caribbean, or Asian, or somebody from the Parks Department had been African, or Caribbean, or Asian, this might have been talked about, because they might have said, hey, well, something along the lines of, hey, this might not go down so well. Just like dogs in parks and Muslims, etc. We need to think about some of these questions about use of space. Now, another concept I really want to put out there for you at the moment is, why is it important then that we're talking about public spaces and diversity? What's in it? Well, there's an idea now called contact theory. Contact theory says the more contact you have, with people who are different to you, the more likely you are to be tolerant and even support policies which promote diversity and difference. In Brexit Britain, the vote was not about economic ties to Europe, it was about xenophobia. That was what the Brexit vote was about. UK cities were resolutely behind staying in Europe. The Come Out brigade were all in small towns and villages in Britain that had virtually no immigrants, but lots of Fox News or Sky News, whichever. One could say contact theory could explain Brexit, and I think there's a lot of truth behind that. So I want you to remember this idea of contact theory, and it stands to reason, doesn't it? The more contact we have across difference, the more likely we are to be tolerant of difference and diversity. So let me move on to just talk about then culture, difference and diversity. Guiding question. And this comes from Wood and Landry. Some of you will have heard of Charles Landry, the Creative City guy. This is an amazing question. At what point do cities see diversity as less a cost, a drag on a scarce resource, and a mind-numbing complexity, and start to see it as a force, a resource, and an opportunity? 40 years ago, big businesses, multinationals, they began to understand if you want to look like, if you want to sell in multiple communities, you need to look like those communities. And they also found that the more diverse a workforce, the more creative the workforce, especially in terms of research and development. So businesses have got it for 40 years. What about our cities? Most of our cities manage diversity. They don't celebrate diversity. The only two cities in the world where I've really seen celebration and diversity have been really Toronto and London. I've seen, you know, I mean, London, you know, since London's become more diverse, you get good food there now. So, I mean, it can't be that bad. I mean, seriously, it's... So, I talked earlier about this idea of cities of difference, this idea of places where we are in the presence of otherness. And our cities are increasingly different. How do we manage coexistence in shared space across this increasing difference, especially when we as city building people, the urban planners, the designers, don't look like communities that we're necessarily working in? And so just Sustainabilities thinking, I think, can help us think across this idea of difference and diversity and heterogeneous populations, as long as we do two things. We embrace the new idea of interculturalism, not multiculturalism, and I'll go on to that in a moment, but we also take seriously the need for cultural competency. Another book opportunity here, folks, and seriously, I've got your summer reading, you know, I got it down here. This book, again, The Intercultural City, Planning for Diversity Advantage. It is a fabulous read by Phil Wood and Charles Landry. It's 2008, wonderfully referenced, but it's not super academic. It's just looking at difference and diversity in cities throughout history. So, whereas multiculturalism, which has largely failed, celebrated difference and diversity, but then divorced it from the reality of day-to-day politics, interculturalism looks at the pluralist transformation of public space, civic institutions, and culture. Okay? How many of our cities, I mean, some will say, oh yeah, we're intercultural. How many cities do you know where the institutions have actually changed as cultures have changed? I speak, you know, from someone who lives in the Boston metro area. Boston is now a majority-minority city, but you wouldn't know that. The institutions are still the good old boy Boston power-based networks. We're not an intercultural city in anything other than mayoral discourse and a few little departments dotted around. The basic power institutions, the pluralist transformation of public space and civic culture hasn't happened, and it's not happening at the moment. Interculturalism talks about dialogue, exchange, reciprocal understanding between people of different backgrounds. This is what the interculturalist approach needs. And I think we, as people in the Congress for New Urbanism, we need to be thinking about that as well. Now, one very practical way that this is going to hit us, whether we like it or not, because a lot of what I'm saying, I mean, you can walk out of here and say, well, you know, yeah, I get what he's saying, but no, here's where the rubber hits the road. Friends of the Park organizations, Friends of the Park. This is a brilliant report, incidentally, 2004, on immigrant engagement in public open space, opportunities for the new Boston. And any of these reports I will share with you. You can have my slides as well. I'm interested in you thinking about some of these things. This is a very important point. The lack of engagement of more recent immigrants in Friends of the Park organizations and other environmental groups of today has led to concerns that while Olmsted's vision continues to resonate with a great many Bostonians, it may not resonate with the majority of those who will decide Boston's future. How do we change our Friends of organizations? How do we do that? How do we adopt an intercultural approach? How do we engage across difference? So let's look at some ideas. Well, one idea that is put out in this particular report is the idea of familiar landscapes. And for those of you who know Boston, there is a park along the Charles in Allston, Brighton called Herter Park. And the report says families, Latino families, gravitate towards Herter Park because for many, the landscape reminds them of home. Extended family gatherings on the riverbanks are popular in Central America, and the trees along the shore remind many immigrants of the all-day Sunday picnics they enjoyed in El Salvador or Guatemala. And a quote, I think some of the reasons that place is so popular with us, Latinos, is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herter Park because it looks like home. So maybe one way of engaging is to look at familiar landscapes, familiar spaces. Another question we might ask about engagement and belonging is, can we design in encounter? And some of you will have seen, some of you will have read about Superkilen Park in Copenhagen. You'll hear good and you'll hear not so good about this. Now, the bottom line is it's a linear park with a cycle path through it, and it goes through Copenhagen's most diverse and different district at Nørrebro. And so what the designers did, a German company, was to think about the local people and what artifacts from their cultures they would like to see in the park. A great idea. It's called asking the community what they want. It's a revolution. Revolution. Now, you know, you talk to some Danes and you talk to some purists, and, but Julian, you know, it's, no. This was 101. We need 201, 301. This was the first time this had been tried on a large scale. This is the right thing to do. Whether it worked or not this first time, I'm not so sure. But the principle of seeing yourself in a public space surely has to be the right way to go. The rest we need to finagle. Maybe it was funding, maybe it was financing. But it's a fascinating space. And, you know, once you've done all of the usual Copenhagen tours, go to Superkilen Park in Nørrebro. Can we design in encounter? Third, I want to really call out some work that my friends at Sheffield University are doing. I was there recently for Landscape 50, which was 50 years of the Landscape Design Department at Sheffield University. They are doing some pioneering work using deep ethnography, deep ethnography. Forget the design charrettes. Let's get into deep ethnography. Let's start to really understand, using anthropological and sociological ideas, let's start to really understand communities. The work they've done is fabulous. And I just want to check. In the middle of this slide is a paper from a journal that I'm editor of, Local Environment, the International Journal of Justice and Sustainability. We published a paper recently by the Sheffield people called Ethnographic Understandings of Ethnically Diverse Neighbourhoods to Inform Urban Design Practice. Be honest, how many of you have seen that paper? Oh, I'm going. John Gilderblum. John, well, I'll give you a kiss after this, John. Seriously, I mean, look, this is right in our ballpark. Ethnographic understandings of ethnically diverse neighbourhoods to inform urban design practice. It's packed with observations, careful observations. We should be reading this kind of stuff. Their work on refugees in parks, I think, has been very interesting. Ideas for integrating refugees into public spaces. Benches for everyone, an anthropological look at benches and the role of benches. And the name of the group is the Transnational Urban Outdoors Research Group in the Department of Landscape at Sheffield University. We need to be looking at practice from different parts of the world. We need to. Hey, my phone's not buzzing as much now. Are you getting bored with this or what? Come on, keep going, keep going. So again, I really want to emphasize this idea of engagement and belonging through deep ethnography. Yes, it takes longer, it's more costly, but you have students at universities looking for research projects. Let's start using them. My students are always looking for good research. Okay, let me just quickly go through a few ideas then about this second notion, not of interculturalism, but the related notion of cultural competency. I think cultural competencies are essential for planning and policy making in these heterogeneous, different urban areas. And my definition, cultural competency is the range of awareness, beliefs, knowledge, skills, behaviours and professional practice that will assist in planning and policy making in, for and with multiple publics. My students did a survey. There is not one urban design or urban planning school that is accredited in the US that has cultural competency as a core curriculum class. Some schools require a little bit of, a couple of lectures or whatever, but wouldn't you think cultural competency, with all that it encompasses, would be a really important thing for planning students, especially those who are going to do urban planning? It would seem to me. But there is no requirement amongst the American Planning Association or the ones that accredit us as planning schools called the PAB, the Planning Accreditation Board. Not yet, but I think there will be in years to come. I put a quote in there: if we want the intercultural city, we cannot leave it to chance. We are leaving it to chance in the US. We're largely leaving interculturalism to chance. It's a very laissez-faire arrangement. But I don't know of any cities in the US that are really taking this seriously, as some cities in Australia and Canada are doing. But Australian and Canadian cities, remember, Australia and Canada, since the 1970s, have had national and federal policies on multiculturalism. Two other urban professional networks, social workers and health professionals, do require cultural competency. And I just want to draw your attention to this quote. Given the strong evidence for socio-cultural barriers to care at multiple levels of the healthcare system, culturally competent care is a key cornerstone in efforts to eliminate racial and ethnic disparities in health and healthcare. Similarly, National Association of Social Workers. So my question then, could more culturally competent planning and policy making help eliminate racial, ethnic, and cultural disparities in what and how we plan and make policy. I mean, it seems that the healthcare professionals are way ahead of us on this. And if culturally competent healthcare improves outcomes, culturally competent planning surely would improve planning outcomes in terms of satisfaction with both what we do and how we do it. So, just wrapping up this section on interculturalism and cultural competency, we need more culturally inclusive practice. If we're going to really manage our coexistence in shared space, we need a more diverse set of placemaking professionals, ones who look like the communities they're working in. It's so important. If you don't look like the community you're working in, are you going to be legitimate going forward? I was on the board of Massachusetts Audubon Society for about 5 years, and they get it in Massachusetts. It's been around, Mass Audubon's been around 100 years. If it wants to be around for another 100 years, it needs to understand what the Brazilians, the Cape Verdeans, the Syrians, the Dominicans, the Somalis, what all of these new Massachusetts residents think. This is not now about organizations doing diversity because it's the moral thing to do. It's about survival. Will you still be around if you don't look like a very rapidly changing America? It's something I think about a lot. And if we're going to move towards just sustainabilities, we need these culturally competent planning and design professionals to understand belonging as much as we understand becoming, to understand humane-scaled planning as much as we do human-scaled planning and design. Okay, I'm going to finish with a few thoughts about how this idea of sharing cities can relate to this idea of difference, diversity, equity, and the idea of just sustainabilities more general. Great book opportunity here, Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities. What we're trying to do in this book is move away from Uber, Lyft, and the idea of the sharing economy, which is really based around a lot of venture capital going into some companies, which was once a good idea, sharing a car ride, sharing a room in your house, but it's now become a huge multi-billion-dollar concern. And in the book, this idea of sharing cities, we argue that a reinvention and revival of the notion of the urban commons, truly shared cities, could enhance equity, rebuild community, and dramatically cut resource use. And that with modern technologies, this intersection between urban and cyberspace provides us with an amazing platform to build a more inclusive and environmentally efficient economy. And when we look at the difference between what we call the sharing paradigm and the sharing economy, I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can read down. I just want to take out two that are really important. The sharing economy sees rational, autonomous individuals. The sharing paradigm sees us as interdependent and vulnerable. The sharing economy sees us as transactions waiting to happen. The sharing paradigm sees us as relational. We are relational. The sharing economy sees market-based solutions. We see political and behavioral change as the way to make cities more shareable, more sharing. And so our sharing paradigm then, if you think about this in two ways, on the horizontal axis, there is the difference between socio-cultural sharing on the right. That's the old-fashioned sharing. That's the sharing that we did when we were on the plains and savannas of Africa to bring down beasts. That's almost the sharing that's in our DNA. On the left is intermediated sharing through one of these. At the top of the vertical axis is communal or intrinsic motivations for sharing. I'm going to share because, you know what, it makes me feel good about myself and the world. And then at the bottom is commercial or extrinsic sharing. That's sharing because, hey, I want to make a little bit of money. I've got a resource that I need to sweat the asset. I'm going to make a little bit of money. So what we have then at the bottom left is the intermediated commercial sharing economy. Nothing wrong with that, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong. But what we're saying in the book is we need to shift it up towards the collective commons, towards the commercial intrinsic sharing and the socio-cultural evolved. So we need to move it up to the area where we're doing this because it's the right thing to do, not because we're making money. And in the book, we create a whole range of roles for local governments in facilitating. And we give examples of Copenhagen, Seoul, Medellin, Colombia, etc., that are doing just that. So in the book, really, what we're talking about is this idea of the urban commons. How do we co-create an urban commons, a more equitable and just space where approaches are more cultural than commercial, are more political than economic, and this urban commons is not expert created, it is co-created. It is a co-produced urban commons. We have plenty of guidance. Janelle Orsi's book, Policies for Shareable Cities. We have a book on sharing cities, activating the urban commons. Evidence from around the world of a growth in interest in sharing resources, not simply for money, but for building social capital. A lot of the stuff that we talk about in New Urbanism. I'm going to finish with my favorite city that I haven't been to, but the more I read about it, I really want to go there, and that's Medellin, Colombia. Who watches Narcos? If we want to talk about urban transformations, this is the urban transformation story of the century. From the 1980s, when it was the cocaine capital of the world, to now, when it is the most celebrated city that has reinvented the urban commons, Medellin has gone through a transformation. Now, yes, they are fortunate. They have their own public utility that gives huge amounts of money, is mandated by the city to give huge amounts of money to these library parks, to public transit projects, to education and arts projects. But the interesting thing as well about this is these projects are not expert-led. They are participatory, planned and budgeted. So it's not just participatory budgeting where communities decide on the priorities of the budget. How the budget is implemented, how the planning works is a participatory planning. So it's kind of a double approach to participation here. Budgeting and then planning how to implement the programs. You have these amazing architectural edifices up in the poorest neighborhoods, up in the favelas or the comunas. You've got this massive new infrastructure. The idea of bringing the poorest into the downtown of the city. And one of the things that I think is really interesting here is that this city and its policy operates around a philosophy, social urbanism. Tell me a city in the US that operates around a philosophy. A lot of Latin American cities do. Food as a right in Belo Horizonte, participatory budgeting. A lot of cities in Latin America operate around a philosophy. And this idea of social urbanism is around empowering citizens, beginning with the poorest. And if you look at the city's plan, public space and infrastructure must become the framework where education and culture are cultivated in places of encounter and coexistence. We're coming back again. Encounter and coexistence. Public space and infrastructure must become the framework where education and culture are cultivated in places of encounter and coexistence. Social urbanism equals just sustainabilities and humane scaled planning. So in summary, what I would like you to go away with, and maybe retweet, we need to think of our work as managing our coexistence in shared space. I mean, we might say celebrating our coexistence in shared space, but it's those words, coexistence and shared space, that I think are the real key words here. We need to be better at fostering belonging, recognition, difference, diversity, inclusion, and thinking about what cities can become. We're really good at the smart, the sharing, the resilient, the sustainable. We need to get better at belonging. We have the tools to foster engagement and belonging, especially using this largely unexplored area of deep ethnography, of really getting to know not just the demographics of a neighborhood, but getting to know the voices, the pulse of neighborhoods. And yes, it takes a little bit longer, but you know what? There are people called students, and they like to do things for free because they get to work. And if, you know, just befriend a professor, and you will have an endless stream of people that can help you do that kind of work. We need to engage interculturally. We need to become culturally competent planners and policymakers. And finally, we need to practice humane-scaled as well as human-scaled urban planning and design. And this image that I put there is in Manchester, England, where a mother and her kids made some cushions to put on the spikes there, and they put some buns and some food there, and said, you know, you're welcome to be here. That's humane action. Thank you.
First of all, thank you, Julian, so much. And now we're going to do this fun Twitter waterfall kind of experience. And you can all see how to do that, hashtagging in there. Do you want to go ahead and choose your own
yeah, I'll choose.
questions?
Yeah.
Okay, you go ahead and choose.
I'm going to be highly selective.
Okay, so.
Are they going to waterfall down?
They're going to waterfall down.
It looks like it's time for cocktails and beer. Certainly is for me. Anybody got a cocktail or some beer or anything? Oh, here we go. That's a great question. I mean, and you know, this point that I was making, and again, you know, I'm not one of these professors who will tell you, I know the answer and there's a silver bullet. I like to think that we can all say, hey, that's a question worth asking, even if we don't know the answer. And quite honestly, with this one, the way that our property market, the way that capitalism works, is part of the reason why we have commoditized sustainability. And many of the academic works that I've seen have really started to say that, you know, the commoditization of sustainability is part of the late stage of neoliberal capitalism. That the irony is that this thing that we 20 or 25 years ago came up with as an idea, as a foil to capitalism, has now been folded into neoliberal capitalism. So in many ways, I don't think there is necessarily a way that we can avoid the commoditization of sustainability unless we really think about intervening in markets. One example is the city of Belo Horizonte in Brazil. They've created their own local food system. The city actually sets the price of certain essential foodstuffs, and private sector retailers have to sell at that price to people on benefits. All of this costs less than 2% of the city's budget, and this is the city that Francis Moore Lappe called the city that abolished hunger. You know, the contact theory idea came out in, it was a psychologist at Harvard in the 50s. And, you know, along with ideas like the cosmopolitan canopy, it really hasn't been tested in terms of urban planning. One of the things that I do a lot as a kind of urban planner who bridges many domains is to bring in ideas that I think are useful in urban planning but haven't been tested. And quite honestly, Grant, I think you're onto a good point here. But I do think, given my British example, that contact theory works at a lot of levels. I mean, you know, the point was that the smallest British villages that voted to come out of Europe were doing so because they had no contact with difference and therefore were fearful of difference. So if I'm misunderstanding your question, I'm sorry, but my point is, I think contact theory holds at various scales. You know, I don't answer questions for people who don't follow me. I mean, seriously, no, actually, I've got to say, Mike Christensen and I want to buy the guy a beer, I've got to say. He's been retweeting a lot of my stuff, so I feel like we're old buddies, you know. But let's see, my observation of sustainability. That's a really good point. That's a really good point. You know, and it's not just cities that are doing that. Universities are. So one of the big things on campus at the moment is divesting from fossil fuels, getting your investments out of fossil fuels. And my university refuses to do it. So the university had a brilliant idea. Let's set up a sustainability fund. So let's put, you know, literally hundreds of thousands of dollars into this sustainability fund that students can apply for while we maintain our unsustainable practices. So in many ways, Mike, I would say that what cities are doing is cosmetic in the sense that they are doing sustainability practices as a foil to continuing a lot of their unsustainable practices. I mean, one might ask, what should we prioritize? Stopping unsustainability or becoming more sustainable? I mean, it sounds like they're the same, but it is slightly different.
We'll stop. Okay, we're going to take one last question.
Yeah, I think I choose, don't I? Do I choose? Yeah. Yeah, I'm not going to take that one. I'll take another question. If there's one more.
Spamming the hashtag with comments and not questions.
Yeah.
So if Emily, who knows so much about this issue, is a national expert in and of herself on this, if you want to ask Julian a final question.
Yeah, sure. Let's do that. You know, I like contact theory. I like people to sort of, you know, to say, hey, why are we doing this? I mean, because has anybody that I've answered been in the audience here? One or two? Okay, yeah. Let's go back to contact theory. Yeah. Okay, yes. Let's do the last one.
Oh boy. Okay. What is your definition of diversity? That's one I get all the time when I talk about neighborhood diversity, and people are really looking for, what I usually say is, it is well, I shouldn't answer my own question, you go for it.
Well, I tend to use the word difference much more than diversity now, because in the US, certainly diversity's come to be synonymous with issues of race, largely. And what I'm more interested in is difference across a wide range. difference across a wide range of possible areas, from cultural to sexual orientation to gender difference, not just gender difference, but differences of using different personal pronouns, etc. So I tend to use the word difference as encapsulating much more the flavor of our splintering personalities away from male, female, black, white, etc., etc. So I don't use the word diversity. I put it in my works because it is a common phrase, or it's a common word that we use, but I don't find it as useful as the word difference, if that's any use.
Interesting.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Julian.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julian. And now, don't anybody leave. Now I would like to introduce Scott Spencer.
Good evening, folks. Wasn't that great? So for the 150 of you or so who are still here, you have a job. It's going to take me 2 minutes, and then we'll release you to the reception. So there's a quote that you know of, that the Congress for New Urbanism views disinvestment in central cities, the spread of placeless sprawl, increasing separation by race and income, environmental deterioration, loss of agricultural lands and wilderness, and the erosion of society's built heritage as one interrelated community building challenge. Very much sort of the theme that we heard just now. That's the first sentence of the charter. My name is Scott Spencer. My first knowledge of CNU goes back nearly to the beginning of the movement. I knew Hank. But it was CNU 24 when I attended my first Congress. At that time, I did a presentation that I later learned was on YouTube about urban development, structural racism, and inclusive practices. Last year at CNU 25, my first as a new board member, I was part of a panel and spoke briefly but pointedly about the last 80 years of public policies which demonstrate structural racism and the exclusion of people from opportunity. That one isn't on YouTube. So here I am at CNU 26, still a board member, and now incoming chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Any wonder how that happened? DEI is the shorthand and blurs the understanding of three different aspirations. That's a conversation for another time, and hopefully it will be tomorrow. My purpose here is to entice you to attend our board listening session tomorrow. It starts at 12:30 in the afternoon, and it's in the Asa Ballroom on the first floor of the DeSoto Hotel. CNU staff and board are in the early stages of our next strategic plan. We have also made a commitment toward being a more inclusive organization. In March, the board and staff jointly participated in a learning session of our own to develop a base knowledge on equity and inclusion. What's next is where you come in, and the people who left that you are going to go, I'm deputizing you to go encourage to come to this session. We do not know yet what equity and inclusion implies or means to CNU. So the session is an opportunity for us to begin that journey together. You may or may not have been an original signatory to the charter, but 2 decades later, you are here as a part of this movement, and as will be the generations who follow. How we engage you and them in the future of the organization, the movement, as well as the places in which we live, play, worship, and work in and in service to, is the focus and theme of this session. I hope among the choices that you make tomorrow, you can stop past, listen, contribute, ask questions that we haven't formed answers to yet, and get engaged. Our evolution is constant. We want to be informed with and by you. That is the first step in inclusion. So it's the board listening session tomorrow, 12:30, the Asa Ballroom at the DeSoto Hotel. Thanks. I hope to see you there. or to engage with you somewhere during the Congress. I got a name tag, I got a board member thing, I'm kind of easy to find. And maybe we'll do that at the reception over in Johnson Square. That starts right now. If you don't know where Johnson Square is, you go down Oglethorpe to Bull Street, you make a left turn on Bull, it's the second square. See you there.